Now there was he came to Greenville, South Carolina in 1958. And there was one man, L.C. Heaston, who was his name. He sponsored Brother Branham. And all the Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, Presbyterians, none of them have anything to do with him. And he had the textile hall there. It was a big concern, a big audience. And I attended every night. It was 5 nights. And there was an old man, G.R. Thomas. He belonged to the Pentecostal church. And I knew him, and he was a godly man, and his mind was leaving him. It was what we called Alzheimer's, I guess. His mind was leaving him. And I went up there 2 different nights and spent the night with him. You know, I had to have somebody day and night work with him. And he couldn't keep the clothes on him. And he all messed up. And they carried him to Greenville, and they examined him, and they said his brain cells were dying, and there was nothing could be done. Well, now he knew nothing about Brother Branham. Nobody knew anything about him, just that little group that I was associated with. That was the only group. But he wanted to go to Greenville. And his people said, well, yeah, we'll take care of that. And they wouldn't pay him any attention because they knew his mind was bad. And so Paul Sheridan, the boy that I know, he was in World War II and he got wounded, and he and I were good friends. And Paul Sheridan and his wife came up there, and he said, here comes Paul, said, see, he lived out in the country about 12 miles. And Paul and Edith came up there, and he said, Paul will take me to Greenville. So Paul drove up, and he said, Paul said, I want to go to Greenville. He said, well, get you some clothes on. I'll take you to Greenville. Said, and he'd do anything the old man had asked because he was a godly old man. And they got some clothes on him, and they got in the car. And there was 2 boys there. They had an old truck. They followed Paul because they didn't know what he'd run into with the old man, the shape he was in. So Paul got to Greenville, got to the main street, and he said, well, Pop, says, here we are. I said, where you want to go now? He said, just take a left here. Paul turned left, and after a while he'd say, take a right here. And Paul said he got me lost. Said he'd take a right and take a left. And said after a while we come in between some tall buildings on each side. And said I was lost. I didn't know where we were. Well, there was a policeman standing there. And Paul drove up and rolled his glass down. It was a hot summer night. And he asked the policeman, says, where are we? The policeman says, you're behind the textile building. Well, that's where the meeting was going on, the textile building. and Paul didn't know. And so the policeman was smoking a cigarette. And he said the old man, G.R. Thomas, got onto that policeman hot and heavy for smoking that cigarette. Said you ought to throw that thing down and stomp it. Said, don't you know you setting an example for the young people? And he just preached to him, you know. And Paul said, I felt embarrassed. Said, I rolled the glass up and drove off. And that policeman standing there with his face red. So he didn't know what to think. So Paul said he drove up there and stopped in behind the textile building. So they sat there a little bit and said, well, he said, Pop, said, you ready to go home? He said, no. Said, just hold tight. Said, I'll let you know when I'm ready. He said, okay. So here come that truck. These 2 boys had been following him. They come up there, and they come by Paul's car, and they drove on up there, and they stopped at the old truck, and they got out. There was two of them. And about that time, old man G.R. Thomas got out of Paul's car, walked up there and got up in that truck. And he was up in the truck, and these two boys are standing on the outside. And here come a big black Cadillac, drove right up beside that truck, and the back door opened, and out come William Branham. And he didn't say nothing to anybody. He got up in the truck and put his arms around Brother Thomas, and he said, Brother G.R. Thomas, I suppose. He said, yes, sir. He said, you're a retired minister of the gospel. He said, yes, sir. And said, you're a very sick man. He said, yes, sir. Brother Branham said, let's pray. And about that time, Paul and Edith was standing there. They had got out. They'd followed him up there to the truck. And these two boys are standing there. And Paul told me, I was on the inside of the textile building waiting for William Branham to come. And Paul said he could feel the ground shaking when he was praying. Said he never heard such a prayer in all his life. And he turned around and he said, now take him home. Said, he'll be all right. And Paul said before they got home, said the old man's mind come clearer. Now I was at church, at Assembly of God Church the next Sunday, and Brother G.R. Thomas was there. And he asked the pastor, Sanford Jones was a pastor, he asked him, says, can I testify tonight, this morning? He said, yes, says, you can. And he began to tell about what God had done for him, how God had healed him. And they didn't even know William Branham. They didn't know nothing about him. But the pastor did. He knew he was in Greenville, but as far as Brother G.R. Thomas and them, they'd never met him before, and they knew nothing about him. And that was his testimony. And he lived several years after that. Never did have any trouble. That was one of the most outstanding healings that I've ever witnessed.